So there may be something important happening with GPUs. AMD possibly may not have a high-end GPU for next generation. You know how we have the 7900X TX, and that one actually surprised the 4080 in a lot of cases, even though it does have its drawbacks and it's a lot less people that buy AMD GPUs compared to Nvidia. Supposedly, these are just rumors at this point, but they're saying from different sources that there's a good chance that AMD GPUs may not have a high-end GPU next generation. That would mean something like an 8900X TX that would go up against, a 5090 or something like that. May not happen. Let's discuss why this makes sense if it is true, and why it would be really bad as well if it would be true. So there's actually like two very important sides to this argument. First, it kind of makes sense because we're sort of in a bad GPU economy after that huge amount of demand because of crypto mining and everybody's staying at home. Everybody was buying like RTX 3000 series GPUs, for example, and even a lot of the AMD 6000 series. That demand kind of like really died off. And now let's hear a word from our sponsor, VIP-CDKdeals.com, a Windows 10 Pro CD key. Add to cart, you put in code CC20. This will also work on Windows 11. You want to go into your settings in Windows, change and adjust your CD key, click activate, and now let's go back to the video. So if you walk into any retailer or check online, anywhere you are in the world, you're most likely gonna find a pretty good amount of stock of GPUs. That means they're not buying. That means that even Nvidia, they're gonna have less incentive to put a lot of money into a high-end product, right? Let's say if the 4090s are still abundantly present in the inventory and everybody can get those GPUs, nobody's really complaining that a 4090 is not enough. What incentive does Nvidia have to release a really next generation GPU that blows the 4090 out of the water? Of course, they're gonna make sure they stay on top, but they're gonna give us little incremental changes. I mean, look at the proof of every GPU we've gotten so far after the 4090, and maybe the 4080 you can make an argument is a pretty decent GPU as well, but not for the price. 4060, 4060 Ti, 4070, they all have, just minor speed bumps and minor benefits compared to last generation. If you buy a 4060, you're not really getting a huge performance gain compared to last generation's 3060 or 3060 Ti. So that's what Nvidia started doing already. And what's the next step aside from not giving us products that have, a pretty big gap in performance compared to last generation? That's just to completely cut out the products in general, or delay the launches. Instead of Nvidia releasing something at the end of this year or next year, they may just cut it out. And that's why I think it makes sense that AMD, which is a much smaller, market share than Nvidia, would maybe not even focus on the high-end GPUs. I mean, the 7900X TX, I would say it's a successful GPU at $999 when it came out. The price to performance certainly is not something that, people were mad at. It did have a couple of issues here and there, some driver problems, definitely not perfect, but for traditional rasterization, definitely a very good GPU. Now, the problem with the high-end market is, let's say if you go out and you're buying a 4080 or 4090, you're going to assume that you want to turn on all of the eye candy, basically including ray tracing. That's something that a lot of games support. If you like it or not, that's really how the future is going forward. And while AMD does have ray tracing with the 7900X TX, for example, it's certainly a much lower level than, for example, the 4090 or even the 4080. If you're playing a game like Cyberpunk and Overdrive ray tracing, you're going to have a lot more trouble on that AMD GPU. It's not something that a high-end buyer wants to hear. So maybe that's why AMD just rather focus on the mid-range and lower, where they can really compete much better with Nvidia. Because let's be honest, they're not going to beat Nvidia this generation, at least on the high end. The 4090 is just flat out the best. And even the 4080, although the 7900X TX does beat it in a lot of cases, especially for the price, the 4080 still kind of comes out ahead if you take all of those Nvidia-centric features into consideration as sort of an entire product, an entire scope scope of the product, especially with ray tracing and things like that, which, let's face it, a lot of high-end gamers, like I'm sitting in front of like, an OLED monitor. I want to turn on ray tracing because I want to take advantage of every single, nice eye candy that I can. And if you have to turn stuff down on a high-end GPU, that's not really the best experience unless it's really cheap. And the 7900 XTX, while much cheaper than a 4080, is still very expensive. It's still a $1,000 GPU. So maybe that's why AMD doesn't want to compete with Nvidia on that high end, because they know in sort of a bad market, they may not have the energy or the resources to really put something out that's going to be able to even beat Nvidia. And maybe it's more profitable for them to focus on like maybe that more mid-range market. Who knows where they're going to make the cutoff for a high-end GPU? Maybe do they go up to like at least a 7800 XT? I mean, I would imagine at least that, right? Maybe like that 650 range or the 579 range, at least to compete with the 4070. I mean, that's kind of what they did with the 5700 XT, a couple of years ago. That wasn't a GPU that beat Nvidia's top end, but at least it kind of competed well enough in sort of that middle and, that mid-range. So maybe that's where AMD really wants to focus. And of course, on the more entry level, like the 7600, maybe to compete with the 4060, maybe AMD thinks that they can really take Nvidia on. Stuff like the 6700 XT really proved to be pretty good compared to the new releases from Nvidia, just because it has more VRAM and in general the performance stayed pretty good. So we're going to have to see on that end, but in a way, it's kind of bad news because what about competition? Once again, Nvidia is going to be completely free to do as they wish on especially the high end. And remember, everything that they have on the high end, they can raise the prices of every other GPU on the stack. Look at the 4070 Ti, for example. That GPU at $799 is pretty expensive. Now, it's not a bad GPU in and of itself for like 1440p. I think it's fine. But a GPU like that would have been much better maybe at $599. I mean, look at the 3070 Ti. That was $599. So the 4070 Ti went up a substantial amount. So Nvidia, without competition, I mean, that's exactly what we're going to see. Let's say a 5070 Ti, they probably would release it at $799. We're not going to see cheaper prices, especially since Nvidia also has all of the AI GPUs in that market to fall back on for their finances to still be okay. They can do whatever they want on the gaming sector because it's not going to affect them nearly as much. So that's bad news for competition. And Intel is trying with their Arc GPUs, but they're not going to be competing on the high end. They have at most entry-level stuff. Maybe they can hit at the mid-range. So the competition is going to be interesting in the entry-level and the mid-range, but Nvidia is going to control pretty much everything, maybe above $600 or $700, which kind of a dangerous territory because that's where the pricing can really get crazy. Remember a 1080 Ti high-end GPU at the time was $699, right? That was like the ceiling. Now, you look at 4090s, some of them are still over $2,000, like those AIO models like from Asus. So that's a huge gap. And of course, a lot of that pricing went up because of all the cryptocurrency mining demand several years ago, like with the 3090, and the 3090 Ti came out at $1,999. And then, of course, Nvidia kind of dropped that 4090 to $1,599, from the price of the 3090 Ti. But it still stayed pretty high, and I don't think they're going to lower those prices. And if they have no competition, they can continue to produce those GPUs. Look at how many 4090s sold. It was a lot. You couldn't find that GPU for the first several months. Scalpers were selling it. So Nvidia knows there's a huge amount of demand for really high-end GPUs. And if there's no competition, they're going to give us something like a 5090, probably for a similar price as the 4090, but without really giving us all that much more like we would expect on a high-end product because they don't have to. It can give us just a little better than the 4090 because it's already a very high-end GPU, still charge us the same or more because who's going to compete with them on that high end? If an AMD is dropping out, we would have hoped that AMD would have had, an 8900 XTX that eventually does compare in terms of ray tracing and maybe even FSR3 to compete with DLSS3. Maybe the power consumption is more efficient, but it doesn't look like it's going that way. unless these rumors prove to be wrong and AMD surprises us and they do have a really big high-end product and they catch Nvidia sleeping. That could completely happen too. That's definitely, I mean, these companies are smart. They're playing these markets, and the gaming market is still important to them. Even though AI is more important, they have like a million other things to worry about. The gaming market is still kind of like a core market. It's visually, big. Gamers complain like we do when things aren't right. And remember, a lot of these people that do AI and they're in that business, a lot of them are gamers too. So they kind of see both sides and which companies are acting in which manner. So it makes sense for companies to, stay really strong in this gaming sector as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if these rumors just end up kind of flaking out and we do get a really high-end GPU from AMD that once again competes with maybe even the 5090 or thereabouts, but who knows what that's going to happen. As of right now, it can go either way. AMD can drop out of the high-end market, or they can still keep trying. I would think it makes sense for them to try. After the 7900 XTX, they're like 80% of the way there, to be at least competitive with high-end GPUs. So why give up at this point? AMD is still a strong company financially, as well as Nvidia, so I hope they stay in it for competition. Let me know what you guys think down below. I'm really curious what's going to happen next generation after this weird GPU market that we're in. Remember to subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you guys on the next video.